This episode's around obviously startup to kind of scale up, and John's going to introduce himself and talk to us around the startup, the MBA journey, and his own sort of career journey thus far. So do you want to kind of introduce yourself, John, and talk to us a little bit about your background and prior to starting My Digital Accounts?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shaun. I'm 56 years old. I know I don't look that old. It's funny when you get to an age like this, you've got experience to share with others. In 1990, which doesn't sound that long ago to me, I qualified as an accountant with PwC. Like a lot of accountants in the Big Four, I then went to work in the consultancy department and ended up as a factory manager, making airline meals. You know, the little sandwiches that you get when you get on a plane. Eventually, it was an American-owned company. I ended up working in San Francisco. So I'm a tech guru or a software guy. I like to explain the fact that I used to work in Silicon Valley. What I don't explain to people is I was only putting sandwiches on planes. I eventually came back to the UK after 9/11 because all the money drained out of the industry, and did the buyout of a company called PayStream with a private equity company called Lloyds Development Capital. Many in the recruitment world will know PayStream. They're the largest umbrella payroll operator in the UK. I left PayStream in 2009 to start and started an accountancy company in a similar industry. I eventually then, the business was growing, but it was very, very reliant on its software. And the software was run by a one-man band. We were very conscious of the fact that was a risk area for the company, a single point of failure. I knew somebody in India from a previous life, and together he became my co-founder, and we set up a development house in India and the UK entity. That's how My Digital came into being, which was in 2015.
Yeah, so I suppose after your kind of extensive background in finance and payroll, etc., what kind of made you start your own software business in MDA?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I'll be able to explain a bit later. Before you embark on a startup, you know, think about it very carefully. What made me do it? I think there are two types of people who start up a business. There's of their own. One is you've got a fierce ambition that you want to work on your own and you want to be your own boss. And probably those who are familiar with the Amicus journey would recognize that's probably describes you and Dave. The other types of entrepreneurs are people who, for whatever reason, become unemployable. They're a bit old, they're made redundant, or something else happens in their life. In my case, I was largely unemployable, which is why I became an entrepreneur. I stumbled into My Digital as a result of one of my other companies I mentioned that I'd started up, and that's how it came into being. That I was always going to work on my own from about 2012. My Digital was simply the next incarnation.
Yeah, and do you want to just explain, you know, in brief terms, explain what My Digital's like solution is to the market, I suppose?
Yeah. So as you know, I'm an accountant by background. My Digital actually started life as an accounting product, looking after temporary workers. It then developed into an umbrella payroll. Software product. For those of you not familiar with the umbrella world, it's a payroll process with kind of margins and other complicated calculations that My Digital was able to cope with. The other more standard software wouldn't be incentivized to invest in, because Sage's market is more mainstream. Ours was niche. So My Digital runs timesheets and payrolls, and there are 70,000 contractors processed through the system every week.
Yeah, perfect. So I suppose, do you want to tell us about the journey in terms of inception and kind of where it is today on that journey? Because obviously you've been founded for nearly 8 years now, and I imagine there's been some heartaches, some successes along the way. But do you want to kind of tell us about the journey at a kind of a broad level, and where you started and where it is today, I suppose, in terms of maybe numbers, etc.
Yeah, so 2015 to 2023, yeah, as you say, 8 years to get to that 70,000 individuals processed through our system. And we're not business to consumer. We only sell to businesses. So our relationship is not directly with the contractor, it's with the intermediaries that actually pay them. So when we started My Digital, the initial customer was, of course, the accountancy company that had been established. We were developing the software, and I quickly fell in love with what we were creating. And I knew that it could be sold wider in the industry. But in order to do that, I could not be running a competitor company. So a management buyout was organised from the accountancy company, and then effectively from that point on, from 2015, I began to sell the software into the wider market. It was 2017 when we got our second customer. So you have a proof of concept, 2016 effectively you can take to the wider market. 2017 was the second customer. Then when we went beyond that, and we'll come to the funding journey in a second, but a big inflection point for the company was in 2019. Our revenue at that point was around about 200,000, £250,000 a year in 2019. We got some institutional investment, and that was an inflection point from which the company then progressed. I think at the time we probably only had about 15 customers. We then from 2019 onwards to the present day, I don't want to say it's like a snowball rolling down a hill and it gathers pace and it gathers mass. It makes it sound a lot easier than it is. But the injection of cash allowed us to scale our business to the point where it has now got beyond startup to scale up. The most significant part of the journey for me, Shaun, was the point at which we broke even. And we broke even sometime during 2021, in the summer of 2021. Might not sound like a significant achievement to people outside, but in terms of a business, I think it's true to say the difference between a startup and a scale-up is a scale-up has achieved break-even. Now, there'll be some people on the call who'll be looking and thinking quite cynically about that, because they'll say, Amazon lost money until 2009, and that couldn't possibly have been described as a startup in the noughties. I recognise that. I can only talk about it from my perspective. So that break-even point in 2021, very, very significant part of the journey. And where we are now in 2023, we're not a mature business, but we are a scale-up. So a lot of the risk is behind us.
Yeah, and you mentioned there about from founding the business 2015, 2016, kind of quite issue proof of concept kind of stage where you're almost testing the product in the market. And then your second customer was obviously achieved in 2017, so a big obviously developing the product, understanding of it, etc. How did you find that as a founder of a business 2 years in and still maybe on 1 to 2 customers? How did you find that, or was that all part of the plan?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about the benefit of hindsight is you kind of rewrite history. So I'm remembering it now as best I can. With the benefit of hindsight, of course, would all be Warren Buffett. And the benefit of hindsight, life will be no fun whatsoever. But when I look back now to 2017, it must have been very, very lonely, because you as a founder, and if you're lucky enough to have a partner, which I did in Ravan, that makes it significantly less lonely. But nevertheless, you have self-doubts, you worry that, why am I doing this if nobody else is doing it? And what drives you on in those moments is that steely determination to deliver on that original vision you had. And I would say the winning of the second customer was probably, if I had to list the 10 most significant parts of the journey, I obviously mentioned break even. The second customer is a big fillip, because once you've got your second customer, it comes not just with the injection of revenue, it comes with the injection of confidence. Don't get me wrong, it's not a walk in the park by any stretch of the imagination, and I'll always be extraordinarily grateful for the patience of those early customers. But that's how I describe it. Yeah, it's lonely, but each little stepping stone is an injection of confidence. And that's what I'd remember of that period.
Yeah, when I speak to sort of founders and stuff like that, I say each step's kind of climbing that mountain, isn't it? I suppose second customer, you've got that, especially selling it B2B, I suppose it's a little bit different B2C, but when you get a second paying kind of customer, you've almost then got a little portion of a huge market, but you've kind of shown that it's not just that one customer buying into the product. It's it's multiple, whether that be 2, 3, or 4. But yeah, obviously 2 years to get to that. So I think the key thing there is kind of always back yourself, believe in the vision, etc. But I suppose that leads nicely on to the next question around funding. What's it been like to generate funding? And I suppose how's that maybe differed from other kind of ventures that you've started prior to software?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I'd like people to take away from this call, if there's only one thing you take away, cash is king in absolutely every walk of life. And I suppose ultimately, when you start out, you're also trying to make cash for yourself, and you're trying to develop a retirement and a legacy. The reality is, you go on the journey, other things other than cash become more important, but cash is king. So funding is an absolute integral part of the startup journey, and there's no getting away from it. There are 3 types of funding, and again, other people have different perspectives. This is from my point of view. 3 types of funding are the self-funding is the first type, which is very easy to conceive of. The second type of funding is friends and family or angel investors. The important thing to remember is in these circumstances, they're neither friends nor family, they're business contacts or colleagues that you have. Because unless you're lucky to be Ewan Blair running his apprentice company with a very wealthy father, most people, when you say friends and family funding, it means business contacts that you've built up over the years. And as well as my second customer that I mentioned being very important, the friends and family who invested in my digital I will be forever in their debt. I'll just come back to the specifics in a second. The third part of the journey is institutional investment. And some people then talk about this as Series A, Series B, Series C funding. That is the most expensive funding you get, because you're having to dilute your equity. You're giving away your equity. That's the most expensive money you'll ever raise. So just before I talk about our funding journey, I just want to go back to what you'd said before, Shaun, which was it's like a series of steps. And that is absolutely true, but it's only a series of steps with the benefit of hindsight. Without hindsight, you're always at the next step up, and there's nothing in front of you. So it's important to always recognise that this is a lot more scary in real time than it is in hindsight. But if we go back to when I first, when the company first started, and self-funding was okay for me to an extent, because there'd been a management buyout of the accountancy company I mentioned. So I'll always be grateful to the management team of that company who provided that self-funding that really kick-started my digital. And that bit's relatively easy because you're backing yourself. You don't have to present. You don't have to present to yourself. You don't have to create a business model if you don't want to. You just empty your own personal bank account and put it in the company bank account. In 2017, we did the second phase, friends and family fundraising. I was lucky enough to have some good business friends in the industry, and they understood the concept of what I was trying to do in terms of a payroll and accounting product for the temporary labour market. So the people who invested, generally speaking, all came from our industry. When I say our industry, I mean the recruitment industry that you and I work in. There were 12 of them. I will have their names emblazoned on my heart forever. And they're very forgiving as well. But I did know that the money was going to run out because we used that to build the team, particularly to expand the dev team in India. Everything is very expensive at that point. You need bigger offices. You need offices that look a bit more attractive. You need individual employees who have got previous experience. Whereas in the self-startup, you can kind of hire people who haven't got any experience at all. So we always knew that money would be burnt through in 2 years. And then we were rather complacent and said, that's okay. At that point, we'll raise private equity money. At that point, as I've mentioned, the revenue was only $250,000. It's too small for private equity type investment. And then you're kind of scratching around, and anybody who survives that valley of death period, as I call it, that's the startup period that lasts for at least the first 3 years of a company. So 90% of software companies fail in the first 3 years, and 70% of startups fail in the first 3 years. That's the valley of death. So we were getting to the end of that period, and I thought, yeah, we'll be able to raise money, and we were too small. We were very lucky because George Osborne, who was the Chancellor at the time, had started something called the Northern Powerhouse Fund. And it was designed specifically for companies like MyDigital, who were in that twilight zone where they had lots of potential, but they were too small for traditional institutions to back. And so we were fortunate enough to stumble into the Northern Powerhouse Fund. And the one in the Northwest that we utilised was run by Maven Capital with the agent, because you set up a government-owned private equity firm, you don't want civil servants engaging directly with entrepreneurs, and so they used an experienced private equity agent to manage the investment. So we were able to raise 1.2 million from the Northern Powerhouse. So by this stage, we'd raised 2.4 million. You're then into the third stage. Now, some companies then run out of money and raise capital again. We didn't. I was hyper-focused on achieving break even. And that's partly as a product of my experience as an accountant. Some people would argue that accountants don't make great scale-up business leaders because they're too conservative. That may be true, but one thing that's undeniable is I was uber focused on break even. We took that money, we took that money in 2019, and as I mentioned, we burned through a lot of it. But at the point we had about £500,000 left in the bank when we broke even in 2021. So that's the MyDigital journey. But if I just use a couple of parallels, I want to talk about that valley of death first 3 years. Most companies end up in there. And some people on the call will be familiar with the likes of Hiring Hub, a product business that seeks to put candidates and clients together to eliminate the human intervention in the recruitment process. Hiring Hub just about made it through that 3 years, but it left the equity behind for all the seed investors. So you still hear about Hiring Hub today, but that was one of those companies that raised all that money. It kind of survived, but everybody lost their equity. There's no shame in that, and it's not to do with lack of effort, let me tell you. An example of something that's been successful, again in our market, is Access Technologies that some of you will have heard of. In fact, I'd be surprised if some of you aren't using a lot of their products. Their timesheet products and payroll products are very dominant in the market. Access Technologies did a refinancing, as you call it, or a further buyout last year at a valuation of £9 billion. Now, what's so extraordinary about that achievement is that company started in 1991, and it was called Access Accounting. It was a software product started by a guy in Colchester, of all places. A number of things happened in that company, but in 2010, they sought private equity investment at a valuation of £50 million. They achieved that, and then in the last 12 years, they turned that value from 50 million into 9 billion. It's an extraordinary achievement, and they are a brilliant example of how the funding model can work very effectively over a period of 12 years. They've turned 50 million into 9 billion, and who wouldn't be happy with that?
Yeah, I suppose the obviously you were fortunate, to have the startup capital to invest initially yourself. A lot of companies obviously maybe don't have that luxury, etc. And I think the thing that's maybe materialised, especially the last 12-18 months, is there's not as much free cash in the market anymore, right? So a lot of companies are having to get to that proof of concept, revenue generation a lot earlier than perhaps they were a couple of years ago. And I think obviously that was your key step, is obviously turn it into a revenue generator. No matter how small that is, early doors, a lot of companies are 3-4 years down the line before they actually even have paying customers, even longer in some instances. So it's interesting, obviously, that you were generating revenue quite, in a shorter amount of time than other businesses.
What would say, Shaun, just sorry to talk across you there, the type of industry that you do a startup in will, your cash requirement will be significantly different. If I can just draw a broad parallel between services business and product or goods businesses, if you want to do a startup where you're reselling oil, for example, you need massive amount of cash to be able to buy the stock, etc. With a software company, you need significant amounts of cash to generate a software product that people will buy. In the services industry, you don't need as much cash. So think about the recruitment market. You simply employ people who then will generate revenue for you there and then. So you don't need quite as much cash. It doesn't mean, though, that a services business is easier to run than a product startup. In some ways, services is harder because you rely on carrying the people with you, because that's your asset. You're absolutely right. I was very lucky, having done startups previously, that I had some cash behind me. So that bootstrap stage, as we call it, and my ability to self-fund did give me an advantage. But most software and product businesses don't have that luxury. So they either find an initial angel investor, or they just have to accept it's going to take a lot longer than they might like. Yeah, it's a really good point you raise.
Yeah. So I suppose in terms of, what challenges have you found and when starting a software business? Obviously, you've had a couple of other startups in that payroll kind of accounting sector. How does it kind of differ? This is your first kind of software venture, isn't it? So what should have been, some of the challenges, and I suppose how does it differ from other businesses?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's such a great question. I mean, when I was doing accountancy startups, that was right in my comfort zone. My head is built like an Excel spreadsheet, which means that things like cash forecasting comes second nature to me. The downside of that is you don't want to get stuck next to somebody like me at dinner, because it'd be a very boring conversation. But moving from being an accountant to being a software expert, what challenges did I face? Well, I didn't have a natural subject matter expertise advantage over others at the time. So it is a bit of a leap of faith, but I was able to find a partner in my good friend in India who helped me set it up. So I was able to lean on him. That was one of the biggest differences with the service companies that I'd run in the past. So that's a big challenge. Make sure you know more about your industry than even the competition. Find a niche, find a like-minded partner, because they'll keep you going during the tough times. The other challenge that you inevitably face is you are naturally controlling if you're a startup. you will probably be naturally controlling as an individual, because you will constantly be nervous about the cash position. That will naturally make you controlling. As the company begins to grow, you have to become less controlling, and that's probably against all your instincts. And as an individual, that's probably the greatest challenge that I faced, is just letting go and giving the team room to expand the business on their own metal, and accepting the fact that you as a founder become not just less important, but in some ways you get in the way, because the things that you need to make a successful startup are very different to the things that you need to make a successful scale up. So some of those personal things, personal personality traits, I think are the biggest challenges that anybody will face.
Yeah. And I suppose from when you're talking around obviously letting that team go, what sort of things you have to consider? Do you just have to kind of give them a little bit more rope to be creative and let them, because obviously at this point now you're hiring people in different areas of the business, probably with more skills in a certain area than you have. So if you kind of just have to give them a little bit more rope to kind of make that journey their own in a way.
Yeah, it's not easy, and if one of my executive team was sitting on this call, so I think about Dan Moss, who's my chief operating officer, who was employee number one. He would probably still describe me as a little too controlling, and that may well be correct, but it's not for the want of trying, and I'm certainly less controlling than I was. What happens to an extent, Shaun, is it happens naturally. So just to touch on to the work that Amicus and other recruitment companies do, and you guys are focused on tech, so you'll be very familiar with this. And as a startup, it's frustrating for a recruiter, because you will be conscious that cash is very important. So somebody writes a job spec for somebody that you know is £150,000 in the market, and then they tell you they've got a budget of 40,000. And I think you and I may even have had some of these conversations in 2018-19. But eventually you start to hire people with more experience, and those people with more experience lead you in a slightly different direction, and they kind of force you to become less controlling, because the force of their personalities, their confidence in their knowledge, and almost the more skilled the individual that you're hiring, the more ability the company gets to scale itself up without its founder. So those bigger hitters are a crucial part of that journey. Now, it does create some significant challenges from a personality point of view. Everything looks easy in a textbook, but the people who get you to that scale-up point are the people who are good in a startup. How do you stay faithful to those people when you bring other people into the business later into the journey? Psychologically, it's extraordinarily difficult, both for you as the CEO and founder and for the individuals who help you through the journey. The only advice I would have on that, and my advice isn't necessarily perfect, but I would say be open. Try to be open as far as you can be in terms of what the business will need in the future. So one thing that we have always had, as well as a 3-year business plan, so you can imagine my cash flow forecasts go out 3 years. They might not be accurate, but I feel comfortable the fact that I've got them. Yeah. We also have an organisation chart that's obviously today. There's one for 1 year's time, and there's another one for 3 years' time. And be open with your executive team as you formulate those organisation charts. Because you cannot afford a CTO, even though you're a software company, when you start. But when you're scaling up, you absolutely need a CTO. And if you can envision that by putting it onto a proposed organization chart, it just makes it a lot more comfortable for everybody when it comes to having the conversation when you are hiring somebody, because it's always been there. So yeah, the marrying the incumbents with new resource that you bring in is an important balance to get right. And one of the other learnings, and I may refer to some other individuals a little later on, is if you bring in a big hitter, assume they're only going to be 50% as good as you think they're going to be, because I think that's a pretty good benchmark. So if you can develop people from within, and that necessarily means hiring young people, hiring people who are not quite at the level you need for the role, that's probably quite a good investment for the future. So yeah, that's how I'd answer the question.
Yeah, I think obviously being in the tech industry, I know a lot of companies may, the first 3 or 4 employees want a CTO, but I think when you actually delve into it's just the job title at the end of the day, they're actually a lead developer, just developing a product that the founder has. Because typically the founder, it's like yourself, you kind of be the product expert. This is what we want the product to look like, and you're kind of giving someone that technical, entrepreneurial to kind of get to that end point. But like you said, you probably initially, in my experience, don't need an official CTO who's kind of running the strategy, so to speak.
Yeah, I would add to that actually, for anybody listening as well, be very conscious that when you give a title, you can never take it away again without ripping the heart out of the individual. And be very careful about giving those titles, because I often say this about salaries as well. You've got to be conscious of the psyche of the individual. You give somebody a CTO title, they'll feel good about it for 4 weeks, then it'll soak into the baseline. You ever take it away again and it'll rip the heart out of your relationship with the individual. So just be very conscious of that as you're growing. Be measured in what you're giving. Bonuses are far easier to give than salary increases, is another example. So they're the kind of things to keep it in mind. Always have a longer term view, because when you try and have a longer term view and then work back to the present, it might take some of that, it might reduce the risk of making some of those errors. In terms of a business as well, and starting a business, I often say to people, think about what the world will be like in 25 years' time, then work back and see if you think you're going to be in the right place. So I wouldn't start a taxi firm, for example, because in 25 years' time, predominantly we'll have driverless cars. And try and have that 25-year view.
I think we've touched on this a little bit in terms of your background, very, very finance heavy, etc. A big thing, obviously, in any startup is, and any business really, is cash, right? Have you got cash to grow, expand? But more important, have you got the cash to, keep the business and the light switched on, so to speak? So how have you kind of managed cash burn? Obviously, you're very senior in finance previously. How do you kind of manage cash burn in a software business? How's it differed, maybe?
Well, I hope everybody remembers, if you take one thing away from this, it's cash is king. Okay, so when you run out of cash, you are in a desperate position. You're in the business equivalent of the homeless people that you see in Piccadilly Gardens. So never, if you can avoid it, just please don't run out of cash. And if you are, make sure you know exactly what your runway is like. Make sure you start the fundraising process a long time before you run out of cash, because institutions will inevitably be in a very strong negotiating position when you run out of cash. So cash is king. What does that mean? I've spoken about having a weekly cash flow on Excel, a forecast that goes out 12 months. And I'm literally not exaggerating about that. You should know exactly what your net wages are going to be. You should know exactly what your payment terms are going to be from your customers, and you should model that and you should live by it. If you can't do it yourself, make sure you find somebody at an early stage of your business who can do it for you, because they'll be worth their weight in gold. One of the bits of feedback we've had from the Northern Powerhouse via Maven is that My Digital is the best at managing cash in their portfolio. Now, there are many things that we'll be bad at, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we're the best at everything, but I would be pretty surprised if there's anybody better at cash management than us. Now, that isn't a holy grail. It's good and it's bad because it means you're a bit too conservative, possibly. Do that weekly forecast for a full year, monitor your actuals against it. There should never be any surprises in that cash flow. And if there are surprises where you're missing your weekly forecast, you don't properly understand your business. So make sure you pause at that point and think about why there's a big cash outflow or even inflow that you hadn't been aware of. Nothing should surprise you in this area. Then a bit of controversial advice from an accountant, particularly in the startup phase: ignore accounting conventions. Make your accounts as close to cash accounts as is possible. So just to caveat that a little, I want you to recognise your revenue in the month that it's earned, but your customers should be paying you within 30 days. If they don't pay you within 30 days, de-recognise the sale. Make sure that you're very close. Don't pay for something up front and then spread the cost over a year, because you're going to mislead yourself. Some accountant might say to you, oh, you bought a computer, spread that cost over 3 years. You could end up legging yourself up. If you buy yourself a computer, count that as an expense. Don't start posting things on your balance sheet, because you could end up getting yourself into a world of hurt. Make your accounts, your management accounts, even your statutory accounts, because you can make statutory accounts on a cash basis as well. If an accountant tells you different, they're wrong. Make your management accounts as close to cash as possible, and that's the other advice I'd give on that. Cash, I can't say it strongly enough, is the most important thing when you're starting and running a business. In fact, it's the most important thing when you're running any business, really.
Yeah,
probably.
I was going to say.
Startup even more important.
I think I understand your point about the expenses and stuff like that, but I might be right in saying that ultimately, because if you expense something over a 3-year period, that 3 year may be gone before your cash is actually gone. So you want to put it in actually the month you've actually got it, invest it all in that month. So it's a really good indicator of actually when your cash is going to run out. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I go a bit further. Accountants make it sound like an art doing it. All accounts are is your bank statement presented in a slightly different way. So don't fill your balance sheet up with all sorts of esoteric items, because it's BS. Get everything through your P&L as quick as possible. And always remember that all your accounts are is your bank statement presented in a slightly different way.
Yeah, great point. So in terms of you've gone from this startup to scale. How many staff are you at now? Is it 60, 70 staff you are?
Yeah, we're at 70. In fact, I can tell you exactly. I think we're at 70, but 2/3 of our staff.
Is this on one of your Excel spreadsheets?
Yeah. It's an org chart with an Excel spreadsheet embedded in it. Yeah, we're at 70 staff. We've got 75 staff. We've got 25 in the UK and we've got 50 in India.
Okay. And how did you construct that landscape? And obviously the dreaded thing, how do you plan for staff turnover?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say, and this is you've always got to be open with your institutional investor as far as you possibly can be. If you compare My Digital with other software companies, to all intents and purposes, the dev center is in India. We've got 5 staff in the UK actually who've moved over from India to work in the UK. So that 660,000 net migration headline you saw today, My Digital's partly responsible for some of that. Let me tell you, our migration is healthy, and I could talk about that all day. 2/3 of your staff being developers is not a standard metric, and if you compare that to other companies, it pops out. But I've got very good reasons for that, and anybody wanting to talk to me offline, I can talk to them about it. The strength of My Digital is in its dev resource and the links we've got with local universities in India, and that's now spilling into the UK. Planning for staff turnover is something that very few businesses do. Now, we've been lucky in India specifically. Our staff turnover has always been below 10% in those years from 2015 to 2023. The standard software industry turnover in India is more like 25%. In the service industries, it's even bigger, it's 40%. In the UK, believe it or not, I'm slightly embarrassed to say this, but in the year ended March 2022, our staff turnover in the UK was 44%. In other words, half our staff were left and were replaced. In the year to 31st of March 2023, it was only 10%. That must be natural when you go through scale up to startup. I'm guessing, I haven't really got much to compare it to, but that figure was a shock, but it was necessary. So what do you do in terms of planning for staff turnover? Well, not planning for it, you're almost guaranteed you're going to bust the budget you've set for recruitment. So I would say, look at your historic staff turnover figures and at the very least bake in 10%. That should be your recruitment budget starting point. Then you've got other roles that you'd hire for, add your recruitment budget onto that. So I would say plan for it, put it in your forecast, put it in your financial forecast, and use your organisation chart to understand where your position is going to come from over the next 3 years. The other little tip I'd have is, and you'll like this as a recruiter, Shaun, but something genuinely I've learned. In the early days when I was doing startups, I was squeezing recruiters down and probably almost being quite proud of the fact that I was moving it from 20% market rate down to 14%. It is a false economy. My advice to people would be make it 25%. Give your recruiter 25% in starting salary, because you've got a better chance of getting the best candidates. You guys sit on the best candidates. You want to put them where they're going to be looked after because your reputation's on the line as well. But more importantly, make sure that you both get the benefit of it. So don't squeeze your recruiters down on margin. That would be a piece of advice.
Cheers for that, John.
Yes, there you go.
No, I think that's a good point in terms of that. You know, I can obviously add some flavor. I think the more invested you are in the recruiter, the better you'll get back. Right? We all know that, especially in the development market, there's a certain level of turnover, especially the first 3 to 6 months. So the more invested you are in that recruitment partner, the more likely you're going to get on favourable stuff. Maybe paying a bit more at the front end. But also you're getting more in return at other bits. You know, there's certain solutions that some recruitment companies offer where they even spread that payment over 12 months at return for a higher investment. So again, you know, it's good from a cash management perspective, cash flow. So I suppose, you know, what does the next 3 years look like for MDA? And you know, like many founders, do you have an exit strategy? Has that been there from day one? What does that look like?
Do you know, an interesting thing is I find a lot of people being coy about this subject. Well, look, let's face it. If you've got institutional investment, you're always up for sale. There's no doubt about that. Some people are uncomfortable talking about it. I don't think I am. So our institutional investor, the Northern Powerhouse, who I will be forever grateful for, invested in 2019. So they've been in 4 years now. Typically, the institutional investors look to get out between 3 and 5 years. So it's realistic to think that at some point in the next 2 years, there'll be some kind of liquidity event. That doesn't mean to say that I, as a founder, will be leaving, but it means that our institutional investor needs their money back with a return. That's absolutely appropriate, and we are committed to making sure that our institutional investor gets that return. Because it's a quasi-government fund, I'm expecting that if they get 2 times their money, I'll get an MBE as well. But where will an exit come from? Somebody wise once said to me a few years ago, whatever your exit strategy is, wherever you plan that the investment's going to come from, it's almost guaranteed it'll come from somewhere else. But that's no excuse for not having a strategy. So our revenue now is £2.5 million. Our EBITDA is £0.5 million. Our profit after tax is £150,000. So EBITDA can be a very misleading figure. Remember what I said about cash is king. The only figure that means anything as a startup in the figures I've just read out there is the 150,000, because that represents cash generation for the company. This year it'll obviously be significantly larger than that. But for an institutional investor in a software company, the most important number is revenue and EBITDA. So we're now at a point where we can go to market, and we probably are at a stage now where we're out of that twilight zone that the Northern Powerhouse helps us out with, where some of the bigger private equity establishments will be more interested. You know, people will always say to you when you start up things like, when you get to 1 million revenue, you'll have all sorts of people interested. Well, I got to 1 million revenue and people weren't as interested as I thought they'd be. And people get to 2 million revenue. I got to 2 million revenue, and then it's just the brow of another hill. Then cash generation becomes the most important thing. So we don't have an explicit strategy to say we will do A, B, and C, and then we'll achieve an exit. But we're very, very conscious of the fact that with an institutional investment that's now 4 years old, there will be a liquidity event in My Digital in the next 2 years. What I would do is go back to the Access Technology story. Remember, in 2010, they took an investment they were valued at 50 million. Now they're valued at 9 billion. So I, as a founder, probably haven't got that 12 years left in me to get to 50 billion, but I am likely to stick around beyond the next liquidity event.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. So I suppose the kind of title was, you know, what would you change with the benefit of hindsight? So what would you change with the benefit of hindsight? As a, you know, looking back, you know, it's always tough looking back. I never like to do it because, you know, you'll think, why did I do this? Why did I do that? But if you had, you know, maybe a couple of things that you would change if you were starting the My Digital journey again, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I would have invested in Access Technologies. You probably think I'm an Access Technologies fanboy, but they are, I was going to say, very dominant in our market. But as I was being a bit churlish before, I said the benefit of hindsight would all be Warren Buffett, and of course that's true. But what would I do with the benefit of hindsight? Well, I want to just reference a couple of other people from the doyens of our industry, I'd call them. There's a guy called Rob Scott from Rulion, Shaun, and who I know you're very familiar with. Another guy that I'll reference, Martin Hesketh from Brookson. These are people who are my age, maybe a bit older than me, so they've now moved on. But I asked them this very question a couple of points over the last 3 years, and they gave the same answer that I'd give. What advice would I give? And with the benefit of hindsight, I would not make what I'd call big marquee hires. So what does that mean? It means that when you're recruiting somebody that's six figures, in my world, that is a huge amount of money. The chances of them not working out are very, very high. And the reason for that is, remember what I said is they're usually only 50% as good as the CV says. But the more significant thing for a startup is a big hire will knock your culture sideways. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, it often is a bad thing, particularly if you're not expecting it. And so be very, very, very careful before you make a big name hire. Reference check them, do all your research, don't do it in a rush. Use professionals to do it. And even when you think you've got it absolutely right, you are still in the area where you're likely to make an error. So with the benefit of hindsight, I would probably still hire some of those big hitters. I might do a bit more research on them, but I would plan for the chances of them failing. Because big hitters, as I'm calling them in this, cost you money, but more importantly, they cost you time. And they may actually cost you some of the resources that you started the journey with as well, because they see this person coming in who's not quite the finished article or everything you hoped they'd be. So with the benefit of hindsight, I would be more cynical when hiring big hitters.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they see recruitment or anything in general, they don't actually look at it, how much time, etc. That takes up, to onboard them, to find all that sort of stuff. If you think of a founder, etc., all that should be added into the forecast of how much time you're spending on actually finding these people. I spoke to a business a couple of months ago, and they'd interviewed 78 people for one position. It was quite a senior level position, but there was a 5-stage process. 15 of them have got to the 4th stage, but they weren't really building that into their actual, the time it's actually taken to find these people as well, which is massively important, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know how it dovetails into your business model at all, or recruitment agencies generally, but if I get to a phase where I'm hiring a big hitter in the future, I would absolutely use a headhunter. I would use somebody who's steeped in experience in the industry, who knows the market, and I would be very conservative about the timescale. You're absolutely right. And I wouldn't be sensitive about paying 25%, 30% of the starting salary as a fee.
Yeah, perfect. So I think the final question, we're almost out of time. It's been I suppose, listeners or people are going to tune in later. What advice would you give them if they were starting a software business today?
If you're starting something, again, I can only speak from my perspective. Other people will have different perspectives, but you will sacrifice everything. And I mean everything. You will sacrifice your social life, you'll sacrifice your family time, you will sacrifice your health and your wealth. Make sure the people who are closest to you in your life are prepared to share that journey. Because it's one thing you having that, it's quite another thing your spouse and your children understanding it. Your children generally just live in the life that they're accustomed to. But your spouse for sure needs to be committed to it. Forget about work-life balance. If you're going to be successful, this will probably be the most important thing in your life. Before family, before your football team, before everything. So I would say, look before you leap. Forget about work-life balance. If possible, merge the two. Now, in my experience, the two are quite merged. The overlap between work and social and family life is such an overlap that I cannot distinguish between the two. And I think you need that, because this will become all-consuming, and at least if all aspects of your life are involved in it, it will be easier to cope with. But make no mistake, there won't be any downtime. You must be prepared to work harder than every single competitor. So I'll tell you my biggest motivator every day. My biggest motivator is I get up in the morning and I know my competitors might be more gifted than me, they might be better resourced than me, but the thing that motivates me when I get out of bed at 5 a.m. every morning is no competitor will beat me by working harder than me. And if you haven't got that in your DNA, you probably should not start a business. You've got to be prepared to sacrifice everything, and you've got to be motivated to work harder than every one of your competitors.
Yeah, it's a lonely place being a founder at times, isn't it? I think you'll definitely experience that. I have in my journey. There's people that you can share it with, but like you said, you've got to be prepared to go above and beyond. Your staff may work to a certain time frame, but you're always going. Yeah, they probably don't even see some of the stuff that you're doing, maybe over the weekend, early mornings, late nights, etc. So I think it's really important, like you said, that you've got to be prepared to sacrifice certain things, like most things in life. But when you found a business, you've got to be prepared to sacrifice, because otherwise, I don't think you can maybe take it as far as you think. And maybe people are different, but that's my opinion also.
Yeah, I'll finish with this little anecdote about the weekend that's about to come. So my digital started in 2015, if you like the analogy. So I come from a big footballing family, as you probably know. 2015, my team, Stockport County, was in the Conference North when my digital started. as they've gone up through the divisions, of course, it's kind of mirrored my own life. And don't get me wrong, when I talk about it being all-consuming, of course I do have hobbies. I'm a Stockport County season ticket holder. Stockport County are going to Wembley this weekend for the first time since 2007 in the playoff final to get to Division 1. That's extraordinarily important to me. And I'm not going to the game, and partly I didn't schedule my calendar properly. I didn't expect us to get to the final. But this weekend, I had arranged to climb Scarfell Pike with one of our customers and his wife. My wife's going as well. Stockport County got to the final. But ultimately, it's BBE, business before everything. And I am sacrificing that trip to Wembley because I've arranged to climb Scarfell Pike with one of my customers, and it wasn't even close. That was a sacrifice that I was happy to make because pressure and those things are a privilege. I'm privileged to have that customer, and nothing in my personal life will ever trump that.
Yeah, I presume you'd be tuning up there on the Pike though, maybe, John, hey?
Well, do you know what? The truth is I've managed to move it from Sunday to Saturday. So I will be able to watch it, hopefully with the champagne on ice. Who knows?
Perfect.
And I hope Stockport County's successes over the last 8 years continue to mirror my digitals.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, that kind of wraps up. We're almost out of time. So, firstly, thanks so much for your time. There's been some brilliant insights into the background of a CEO and how it feels to grow a software business. Some great piece of advice. I think the main one, cash is king. I think it's a big. It's kind of an easy statement, but a lot of founders kind of get that wrong. They don't really think about the cash because once your business runs out of cash, that's it. So, brilliant bit of advice, really. And sometimes maybe that's been a huge strength of my digital, the fact that you've come from that accountancy background, that you've always had that at the forefront of your thinking, whereas somebody maybe come from a development background, something else into a software business, that's probably not maybe at the forefront of the thinking. So thanks so much for your time, John.
Shall we finish on this then? Charles may be king in name, but cash is always king in reality.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, John.